This week, we welcome professor and author Wilfred Reilly.
But I think there's an easy three-part definition of woke, actually, that comes right out of critical theory. Wokeness is the belief that all of society is structured to oppress intentionally, and that all gaps in performance reflect this structuring, and that the solution to this vile bigotry that we've discovered is equity, which means proportional representation regardless of performance. That's pretty much it.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you are welcome. You know the drill. Please subscribe, rate, comment, share, reach out, tell your friends, send smoke signals, whatever. We love your feedback and we want to hear from you. If you like our work and want to support us, the best way to do that is join Phetasy.com. You'll get access to behind-the-scenes content, outtakes, discounts on merch, and the ability to submit questions for some of our upcoming guests. Support your favorite scrappy little internet heroes at Phetasy.com. I am here with Wilfred Reilly, everyone. Welcome to Walk-Ins Welcome.
Glad to be here.
I'm so excited to talk to you. It's going to be a fast, I feel like this is just going to fly by. I have so many questions, but I've been down the Wilfred Reilly rabbit hole reading. I read your work all the time, but I went down your list at the top of your Twitter that you nicely posted of a lot of your work. And I've decided that you could save America if everybody read you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to hear.
I feel like the key to saving America lies within your work and scope of work. And just tell the audience a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Well, I mean, in terms of like the cliche American question, what do you do? I'm a professor of politics, political science at Kentucky State. And I mean, what I do is kind of standard for that role. I write, I teach. The thing that kind of attracted me some public attention, I think, is the focus of what I write about, which is bullshit, essentially. Like trying to find the disconnect between a lot of what people believe in modern kind of upper middle class life, I guess, and reality. So I wrote the book Hate Crime Hoax, where I kind of set an eye on the really undeniable reality that, you know, obviously most sexual assault claims or fistfight claims are real, but that of these very high profile cases of kind of racial tension and racial conflict that we'd seen in the media for years, Jussie Smollett, Bubba Wallace, Covington Catholic, Duke Lacrosse, I mean, you know, Wisconsin Parkside with the nooses, Kean College with the death threats, Air Force Academy, where a general had to go to campus and give this speech against racism, Drake, Goucher College, just like on and on. All of them turned out to be complete BS. And so I wrote a book where I didn't just, I mean, the book was from the right politically, but I didn't just kind of point, you know, Nelson on The Simpsons style and say, ha ha. I was genuinely curious about why this was. So it turned into this whole thing. It's about 300 pages long. And I get into the power of victimization in these weird lefty spaces that are developed on campus and why people believe these crazy things. Like that was one of the first, I think, texts to note. Other people like Skeptic Research Center have done this much better since, but that the average white liberal seemed to believe that hundreds or thousands of innocent brothers every year are murdered by the police, all this sort of thing, and that this had nothing to do with reality. Right. And that as a result of this dichotomy between people existing in this space where there was almost no racism, where, you know, interracial couples were publicly hooking up all around you, and this narrative that you were hearing, you saw almost the creation of this sort of fake oppression. So that was the first book. The second book, I don't know if that made much sense, but hopefully.
No,
The second
made
book,
a lot of sense.
Well, good to hear. But the second book, Taboo, is more specific. Like I looked at 10 of the things that were being covered at a really high profile level in national media at the time I wrote, which was 2019. And again, looked at whether the storylines we were seeing at all matched reality. So, chapter one of that book looked at the Black Lives Matter narrative, which again was based around the idea that there were very high levels of police violence against innocent, mostly unarmed African American men. And by that point, the Washington Post database, The Counted, had been uploaded online. And I was able just to check through that, as did a couple other people like Heather McDonald, to give credit, Roland Fryer. And what I found was pretty astonishing. I mean, in most years, 2015, I believe 38 unarmed Black men were victims of fatal police violence, and it went down from there. I mean, 2019, 2020, you're talking about 17, 20.
Mm-hmm.
So the entire narrative was based around almost nothing. There were less, just going point by point, there were less than 1,000 people killed by the police nationally in almost every year out of generally something like 60 million interactions. One, the huge majority of them weren't Black, too. The reality was just that the media entirely ignored the Hispanic, Irish and Italian American, plain poor white, so on, Native American cases. They just swept them entirely under the rug. I mean, out of 1,000 people in a typical year, identified Blacks would be about 250. So that was point two. And even then, you could argue, well, that's a bit disproportionate. You know, we're 14 or 15% of the population. You could even say 13%, but we're 25% of the casualties. But the Black crime rate is also more than twice the white crime rate. If you dig into something else I've worked with, which is the Bureau of Justice Statistics Crime Report. It's not 5 or 10 times the white rate, as the alt-right sometimes claims. And you have to adjust for age. We're a lot younger. Most common age for a Black man's 27, white man's 58. But the numbers just are what they are. I mean, if you do that adjustment 2-for-1, and then you look at the 25 versus the 14, it all just goes away. So there didn't seem to be a problem there at all. The entire national movement was based around these 15 or 20 guys a year, most of whom were career criminals. So that was just one chapter. And I mean, the next one went into kind of interracial crime, which we were hearing a lot about at the time, with all these crazy stories of, you know, Black and white people are coming to blows. You can't even go to the dog park without someone of another race sneaking up from behind you and hitting you over the head. It's terrible. It's like the 1950s all over again. And as a citizen of a big city who was used to like walking through the club district and seeing everyone just interacting, I mean, like Louisville is one of the smallest places I've ever lived. This just seemed like incredibly unrealistic. Louisville and Frankfurt. Frankfurt is smaller, frankly. But I mean, and I live in Frankfurt. Shout out to both cities. But I mean, just this seemed incredibly nonsensical. It seemed wildly untrue. Like just the neighborhood where Jussie Smollett claimed he was attacked is Streeterville. It's the Chicago Young Professional District. I still have buddies living there.
Yeah.
So I mean, I started looking at this, and again, so if you want to make claims about interracial crime, first of all, out of all serious crime, what you call index crime, there are about 20 million index crimes a year. Violent crime and the most serious property crimes, carjacking, burglary. Of those, about 3% are what you call classic interracial crimes. Violent crimes that involve either a Black guy attacking a white dude or a white dude attacking a Black guy. So first of all, like interracial warrior on warrior crime is 3% of crime. The person most likely to kill you is your husband or your wife.
Right.
And I mean, there's kind of a joke I make at dinner speeches that's not really a joke, but in many years, it's your current husband or your ex-wife, which I do think really says something kind of deep about men as versus women. Men, kind of the dumb brutes, like you didn't do this right, whereas women, perhaps capable of longer-term strategic planning. You know, that bastard, he thought he'd gotten away. You know, at any rate, though, the very tiny figure. But if you insist on talking about this, like if you insist on bringing up discord among countrymen, the next point is that this is 90% Black on white. Like, we don't need to talk about it at all, but it definitely does not cut in the direction of Klansmen attacking Black people. And we see the same thing with anti-Asian hate now, where
Mm-hmm.
there was a strong attempt to pin this on whites or even Asians themselves. And then we started seeing the videos, and it was almost invariably like urban Black guy kicking Asian elder down the stairs. So that
Mm-hmm.
was chapter 2. Like, we don't, at least we didn't prior to the George Floyd riots, have an epidemic crime problem in this nation's cities. Now we kind of do. But if we're going to discuss crime, I mean, let's discuss crime. Crime is heavily concentrated among young working class men, more than 50% of them, 53% or whatever it is, people of color. You're not going to be able to pin this on Republicans, so that's chapter 2. And I just went through a whole bunch of different topics. I didn't find the alt-right's arguments very convincing. I mean, the argument that being a large, diverse country kind of correlates with failure didn't
Right.
make sense. I mean, Brazil and Britain and the USA and so on, India, France seem to be, outperforming Ghana and Iceland. But I mean,
Yes.
I most of it focused on the left, cultural appropriation, white privilege, so on. So the entire book was about what's reality, COVID, but what's reality and what's gender, but what's reality and what's nonsense.
Yes. I really appreciate this is why I think you're so necessary in this whole entire discourse. I loved your quote from your tablet piece, the assault on empiricism, which is something that I think you cover so well. And that piece, I think, did very well. The more our baseline assumptions are based on, forgive me, bullshit, the less capable we are of addressing real world problems in real time. And that is something I don't have the numbers and the facts, and I can just instinctively intuit that this is a problem in our society right now. There's so much hyperbole, and there's so much using that hyperbole for activism. And then nothing actually gets addressed, as you said in this article, when COVID hit. It just became, you're a grandma killer, and people start throwing these insults. And then it seems like an easy way to deflect from actually solving problems. What's your take on this allergy to empiricism?
Yeah, I think that's one of the better questions I've been asked. And I mean, I think there are levels to it, honestly. I mean, so first of all, you're absolutely right that people who are in leadership levels are making decisions based on just complete bullshit data. And I mean, to give just some very quick examples, like with COVID, so I don't want to misstate this figure because it's kind of complex to say, but it was 41% of Democrats think that more than, and think this now, this is like, I think February 22 data. Well, I guess that's not now anymore, but very recent. But think that 41% think that more than 50% of the people who get COVID are hospitalized or go to the ICU. So like near death level, like you're either
Mhm.
an inpatient or you're in the ICU if you just get COVID. So that's
Mhm.
more than 40% of all Dems and more than that among women. And that is the figure that directly has been used to justify lockdowns, for example. So I
Mhm.
mean that's an astonishing figure. It's worth noting, by the way, like COVID was real. Like the anti-vax stuff on the extreme right's crazy. I don't understand that at all. Like I'm not
Yeah.
getting boosted every 2 months, but like I'm
No.
vaccinated, and like you know,
I
I'm
was
a
joking about that today, because have you seen the Hamlin stuff going around?
oh yeah, it's just the wildest shit. Like the thing with this,
For
like
the
I love,
audience, they think that he's a clone, essentially. That's what they think.
but it's just it's the most non-scientific. So I actually like Peter McCullough is a good doc. Like I actually read his paper. And
Mhm.
so okay, like in the category like young men slash good athletes, there was an increase in fatal myocarditis from, I'm sure someone in the comments will correct me, but it's like 210 people to 1610 people globally. Now there are 8 billion people on the globe. So I'm sure that happened. And it's very likely the vaccine played a role there. What's that, like an 8x increase? So, yeah, okay. And that's very troubling with a medical product. Like we probably shouldn't give that to pregnant women or something. But if I were a ruthless, amoral leader, something that I very likely will be at some point in my life, and I had to make that decision, someone was like, on the side of the light, of course. But someone was like, look, Reilly, there's a disease that's killing 3,000 people a day. We have this vaccine. There's a 50% chance it will kill 1,000 young male warriors, but it will save this number of grandmothers and babies every day if you give it to people. Are you going to authorize that the vaccine be used? The answer is an obvious yes. So
Right.
it's happened. Maybe. We don't know. I mean, we have to recheck his paper. But like the reaction to this, like where people are doing this died suddenly thing, where
Yeah.
every single one of those 1,600 people is being identified. People are like looking up files like this school teacher and soccer player fell over in Cardiff, France. There is an element of come on to it. Like
Yeah.
COVID wasn't the apocalyptic, it wasn't the rage virus, but and the number of people we lost, like 350,000 people a year. I'm going to take heat for this comment, but it's not an extraordinarily large amount of people. 4 million people die, 2.8 to 4 million people die in the United States every year. But nonetheless, if the COVID vaccine cuts that rate by 80% for vaccinated people against the first strain, it's probably a good idea for anyone over 40 to get the COVID vaccine. And the
Hmm.
whole backlash to the vaccine, where people are calling it like the clot shot and saying that if you take it, you're gonna die. And like you have all these accounts, I think it was Cat Turd that's for the past couple of days has been posting and saying on Twitter and other social, like, if you're vaccinated, you should be terrified for the rest of your life. Like, of what? That's
That cuts both ways though too. I have had friends who have had falling outs with other friends who when they didn't want to get the vaccine and they've
oh yeah,
said,
yeah.
"I don't know if I can talk to you. You're crazy for not getting the vaccine." Particularly a lot of pregnant women I know were very hesitant. I didn't get boosted when I was pregnant just because I was like, I'm willing to experiment with myself, but I don't know if I'm willing to like take that risk with a unborn child. And I think largely it's been shown that it's fine, but I also think that people had that same craziness that they have. My favorite conspiracy, I think, during that time was the shedding. Like you're gonna
Mm-hmm.
shed on me, the vaccine on me. That was my favorite one. There's so many, and this is again, it goes back to the question of what is the allergy to facts. I can't imagine what it's like being somebody like you who goes through the world armed with actual statistics and facts and data, and no one wants to hear it. No one really. They're just like, oh, and this is not. This seems to be a problem that, and despite what people think, it exists. It's a bipartisan problem we face.
Well, it's just like anything else. Like, I mean, I'm a reasonably fun guy with a decent job, but when I was single, like 1 in 2 people would say no if you asked about. Like, people say no to things. People have opinions that you think are ridiculous. 1 in 2 people vote against my preferred candidate. But I mean, so like with the COVID thing, though, one caveat I will give to like the amoral leader situation, like, so obviously, if you know that there's a vaccine that's going to cause 1,000 deaths and save 1 million lives, you authorize it. The one thing I would say is you might not authorize it for healthy young males. But I
Right.
don't I don't think anyone specifically knew that the vaccine posed a risk, at least very early on, to healthy young males. And I'm still not sure we absolutely know what the level of risk is. But I think we agree that the people panicking about the vaccine are taking it to some wild places. Like I've seen people claim the vaccines killed millions of people. And the actual data I've seen, and it kind of lasts on this from me. I do want to hear what you have to say, but like the actual data I've seen is like terrible in the other direction. Like the
Mm.
philosopher Liam Bright, who's like a guy on the left, but who's good with data. Like the other day just posted like deaths by party per month, like looking at I think the way he did this was county level in states based on voter registration. And prior to widespread availability of vaccines, because of the incredibly shit job the Democratic governors did, like shoveling COVID sick people back into nursing homes and this kind of thing, and the crazy like triage by race, probably like all
Right.
this like borders on evil stuff, like there were far more deaths in democratic states like New York, for all their
Yeah.
talk, was it was the leading COVID death state for months, while they were like making documentaries about this guy Cuomo and so on.
Yeah, no,
Just
that was
crazy.
nuts.
Yeah, but I
He
mean
was
for the
taking a victory lap in the middle of the pandemic. It was
the
so weird.
the wildest thing about this to me was that he released a graph called like New York's fight to the top of the mountain. And if you've ever been in like a disaster situation, like I've been on the very junior guy in some teams looking at bad shit, like the worst thing you could have is a curve that looks like you climbing Mount Everest in terms of the number of bodies and then coming back down. So it was
Right.
like, and everything had like a cute face next to it. Like, this is when we realized it came from China. And it was just like, good God, this is like a horrible, dark joke, you
Yeah.
bastard. But the thing about this, though, is that after the vaccines became available, like if you look at Bright's graph and you followed along, it was pretty painful for me as like a guy on the right. Like it absolutely flipped. You started seeing far more deaths concentrated in the red areas. And that
Mhm.
absolutely is because all these people were like, nope, not taking the clot shot. And it didn't matter if you were me, even like a little fat, but like 40 or 35.
Mhm.
But for like all these 65-year-old guys that were like, nope, Twitter told me not to do it. They got them trackers in there. That's not good. And some of those people did die. Now,
Yeah.
again, it's just as easy to flip the script and say, what else killed a whole lot of people? Defunding the police. Like they're crazy policies that come from all sides of the spectrum all the time that have real effects. Like murders went from like 13, 14,000 back in 2014 to 22,900 last year. So I mean,
Wow.
it's a game both sides can play, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that the not taking the vaccine was more of a social, it wasn't a policy. The issue I have now in light of all the data with the young man stuff is that they're still making kids take it to go to college,
Oh yeah.
and I'm like, why? We know that they don't really need to take it, and there is a risk to men at this age, even if it's small. I don't think we should be minimizing that kind of side effect as like something we just brush off as oh, well, we'll just take that as a chance when they'll more likely survive COVID and they've all kind of had it. And then I also don't know what the instance of getting myocarditis is if you get COVID versus the risk if you get the vaccine. So that's not data that I've gone, down the rabbit hole of.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I should make this clear. I don't think the left's response to the pandemic was good either.
Yeah.
I actually think Trump's response to the pandemic, interestingly enough, was pretty good.
Yeah,
Like
I looking back, yeah.
yeah, like people forget that like Trump initially wanted to seal the border to China.
Yeah.
Like it was Trump that was wholly responsible for Operation Warp Speed. And you might not like Fauci, but he dragged like Birx and all those other doctors into the project. Like the vaccine was wholly developed under Trump. So this is something that's been completely like blank masked, is the Chinese term, by both the left and the right. And like
Mm.
I, like Pepperidge Farm, remember. Like, I remember Kamala Harris saying, like, I'm not taking that Trump shot. I'm not putting that in my body. That
Yeah.
underdeveloped bullshit from President Trump. Like, I mean, that's what everyone said, on the political left for quite a while. I mean, like when Biden came into office, he was saying things like we had inadequate vaccine stockpiles to separate himself from Trump, who, by the way, had quite a lot of vaccine stockpiled. So, I mean, that was a complete flip there. And interestingly, like Ron DeSantis, when he runs against Trump, I would virtually guarantee that one of his big paths of attack is going to be that Trump was responsible for the vaccine. I mean, so it's just bizarro world in politics. It's just like all
Yeah.
BS all the time. I mean, but the one thing I was going to say there though initially is like the left did not respond as opposed to the center right, which is where Trump really is like in his heart. He's not actually like he doesn't hate vaginas and dislike gay people and really want to live in, Bismarck, North Dakota instead of Manhattan. I mean, the center right handled this pretty well in terms of like how business adjusted, like how nightlife started reopening, so on. But I mean, like the actual left, no, I mean, their response was probably worse than the right's. It was just, it was as extreme, but in the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of
Mm-hmm.
like the 60-year-old guy refusing to get the vaccine and bumbling around talking about clot shots, you saw like healthy 29-year-old people staying inside for like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And people now deny that this happened. But I mean, like, one of my jobs was in social media for a while in Chicago while I was in grad school. One of my jobs was in canvassing at the management, although field management level. Like, one of them was in grad schools, like a RA. Like, I know a bunch of people that went on in those fields. And like people in Chicago, people in Louisville, Cincinnati, I can only imagine New York, were like in the crib, locked down in these condo buildings for 12 to 18 months, everything by
Yeah.
DoorDash, like robots and drones coming to their houses. It was absolutely insane. Like kids were eating outside in Chicago and Cincinnati. It's like
I
-8,
know. I know.
masks on. So, I mean, I think in terms of years of life lost, like these were like fitness girls, like age 29, like you gained 100 pounds. Like in terms of years of life lost, alcoholism, I mean, I think
Alcoholism.
there was far more damage done in years of life terms, not minimizing either side, by the lockdowns than there was in terms of very upper end death. And that's not me. That's like Rand Corporation. That's been found over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something I was raging about when I was in I have been raging about being in Los Angeles. It was very much like you describe, and we can be outside pretty much year round here. And you still had kids playing outside in masks like a year ago. It was insanity. And I saw just so much craziness and really people just losing their mind. I always joke about the time that my cousin and I were on a walk and we were outside and somebody kitty corner across the street from us was screaming at us and he was like, "No masks! No masks!" An old man. I'm like, "You're gonna have a heart attack from yelling at us. The chances are much better of that than you getting COVID from us across the street." Just people really, the fear took over. And I do wonder if that is at the root of that question that I asked you. What is this? I just feel, in the kind of facts don't care about your feelings, um, is, an expression we hear a lot, but it doesn't really seem like there are that many people committed to finding out the facts. And even if they do, they find a way to dismiss it, or they'll go look for evidence that they can find online that says the opposite of whatever might be true. How do you handle having these debates and conversations with people when it seems like they don't want to believe what you're presenting them, even if it's right there and in front of them?
Well, I think a big part of my approach is what on sales and trading floors is just called being PA, professionally aggressive, which is just being confident, being funny, but like saying things that are true. So
Mhm.
it's not like, shut up, you motherfucker. It's just sort of like, well, no. I mean, so like I'll usually just drop a link. So when someone, and it's interesting that actually a lot of the most forbidden people on the internet, from Steve Saylor on the right to like Hockey Mod Booty or Umar Johnson on the left, this is just what they do, where like they'll just say, like if Steve Saylor's like there's a lot more violent crime among black people, or Umar Johnson's like there's a lot more perverse crime among white people, they would just have that ready to go and they would drop it because both
Right.
those things happen to be true. I mean, I would suspect, in fact, I know both of them happen to be true in most years, depending on what you're talking about.
Right.
Murder and bestiality, let's say. So, I mean, it's that strategy. Um, I didn't model mine on either of those approaches, and I'm not necessarily comparing those two gents, but I'm just saying, like, if you're going to say something that's going to piss people off, the best way to do it is just to say, well, these are the facts to some extent. So, I mean, for me, generally what I do is just take the actual data and, confidently, reasonably, aggressively say, well, this is the reality as I see it. Um, if you're talking about police violence and someone says the police in America are murdering hundreds of people, I would just say, well, according to the Washington Post, the total number of people that were killed by the police last year in the United States that were unarmed, that were black, was 7. And here's the link. And I would show it to them.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much it. I'm kind of rambling here, but that's basically the technique, and it works
Yeah.
pretty well.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know. I feel like more people are, for the most part, pretty reasonable in real life. When you have these conversations, they seem to be, you're able to navigate them. Online, it just descends into chaos a lot of the time. Even posting links. I saw this a lot with a lot of the COVID debate. I see it a lot around gender, which is, another hot button topic. And I mean, I love hyperbole. I'm a comedian. So I think
Okay.
that I often say comedians need to die on the hill of defending their right to be hyperbolic, because not necessarily even defend whatever they were saying, just defend their right to be ridiculous. And so it is a strange time where you can't really be hyperbolic for fear of being canceled, yet everybody's speaking in hyperbole, and there isn't much of a devotion to science or facts or any of it. And I think this leads me to my question about your take on wokeism and woke, because you're one of the few people I've seen define what that even means. People throw it around as a pejorative. People throw that word around on both sides, but what is your definition of the word woke or wokeism?
Yeah, actually, can I say one thing about like
Y-
the last topic?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like my response there was really kind of disjointed. So there are a couple things there. Like, so first, one of my pieces of advice to people that engage on social media is just to block people that are idiots. So I mean, really, I don't see why you wouldn't. A lot of
Yeah.
my friends that are heavily involved in internet culture have almost this moral commitment to free speech. And
Mhm.
as I've said, I'm pretty amoral. Like, I think in the business realm, like in the competitive realm, I'm nice to dogs. But I think that you have a perfect right to speak. But if you're an idiot, I don't really see why I should let you waste my time, which I value at several
Mhm.
$100s an hour. So if you keep yapping at me about nothing, I just remove you. I
Mhm.
also block people. I don't mute them, because if you mute people, you allow someone to talk to everyone else you interact with, including
Mhm.
friends, lovers, so on. You just can't see them and respond to them and kind of discipline them for saying stupid stuff.
Mhm.
The professionally aggressive approach, I think, really is the way to go about it. Because very often when you're debating, this is an old rule of debate. I mean, I've been asked to coach debate teams at KSU, which is quite a compliment at HBCU. An old rule of debating is that you're not really talking to your opponent. Like the guy from Morehouse, let's say, isn't really going to change his mind that society's a bit racist. But is the audience, which is 40% Caucasian and made up of people from 30 schools, going to agree with you and clap and award you the points if you make that case using data? So, I mean, almost everything I say, I kind of support with the link. And
Mhm.
by the way, when I mentioned those other guys, an important point is that I wasn't criticizing them as like even crazy people do this. I think that they're actually pretty good examples of people that do it kind of skillfully.
Mhm.
I think that if anything, what the cancellation stuff illustrates is that there are limits on who can say certain things.
Mhm.
So, I mean, like Steve Saylor, for example, is a guy I've argued with honors about even online. Uh, Almost everything he says is just some kind of crime stat. There's no way most people are going to publicly cite that dude in an article. I might. if
Right.
it's just, again, some sort of statistic about crime. But I think the idea is sort of white guy from the far right would be the perception. I'm not sure that's how he would think of himself, is saying the forbidden. If anything, Johnson, who most people probably wouldn't cite either, would be viewed as more tolerable and closer to the center, despite the fact that in addition to saying things that are undisputably true, which is quite often the case, he'll also say shit like, stuff about the personal hygiene of white women and so on, just go like wildly off the rails, because he gets sort of a black guy pass for doing that, or a hip hop pass for doing that. So I think there's a great deal of BS once again mixed into all this. And I probably get something of a break as, well liked, somewhat hip hop, younger, black, etc. person. But within the realm of the uncanceled, having a reasonably polite conversation. I mean, generally, unless you're talking to an idiot, if you just say something like, boom, here are the facts, you've won the argument to most of the room. And the last comment on this, because you had a really good question, and then I started talking about something else for 5 minutes. But I mean, it's worth remembering that most people don't believe what crazy people think. So I actually am a pretty decent statistical methodologist. I think I've been writing more qual stuff lately, but like I've done a couple very large polls where I've like gone on Twitter, and I like 70,000 Twitter followers, and I've linked it to like Survey Monkey. We're almost at the point where this is scientific, and not that it is yet, but I mean, I've asked tens of thousands of people questions like that are come from a gender studies textbook. Like, do you believe that some women have 9-inch penises? And the response rate is like 99.4% no. Just to like the flat question itself, from my like heavily feminist business girl circle of friends, as well as my right-wing buddies, like no. Like the 30% feminist club chicks are just like, nope. I wouldn't say this in public, but hell no. And so, I mean, you're not talking to the one crazy guy off in the corner shouting. You're talking to everybody else. What's woke? I think there's an easy three-part, and after this sentence, I'll shut up and see what the rest of the question is. But I think there's an easy three-part definition of woke, actually, that comes right out of critical theory. Wokeness is the belief that all of society is structured to oppress intentionally, and that all gaps in performance reflect this structuring, and that the solution to this vile bigotry that we've discovered is equity, which means proportional representation regardless of performance. That's pretty much it. Like every woke program breaks down basically to this. And it's just, again, a completely nonsensical argument. If
so
you
it's
ask,
not a class thing, though. It's a race thing.
well, it's a whatever you want it to be thing, but wokes invariably ignore class. This is a big split between wokes and the old left. And I think the reason for this is that something 55% is a commonly heard figure of poor people are white. And you really notice this like in Appalachia. Like, I mean, I'm sure that the technically reported rate for the specific crime of murder is lower than in some black neighborhoods, but I've seen higher crime rates here than I've seen almost anywhere else. Like trailers that have exploded because people are cooking so much meth in them. Like, it's one of the very few areas where they're like neighborhoods where I wouldn't walk around at night without the strap. Like, I mean, there's some working poor white communities in Kentucky that are pretty notable and that are legendary for that, have been for some time. I mean, so it would be very difficult to go to like Holmes Street in Frankfurt, or like one of the integrated projects in Lexington, or even just certainly, Harlan County and up in the hills, the real Appalachia, and come away from that thinking, well, I've just encountered a lot of white privilege. So that's never engaged. That's never talked about. No one's going to Owen County, West Virginia, So, and a simpler way to put this might be the reason that woke dialectic focuses so much on race, who you like to sleep with, and sex might be that those are the characteristics that differentiate people in these sort of lower Ivy League environments where virtually everyone is upper middle to upper class,
Mm-hmm.
virtually everyone is financially stable, virtually everyone is decent looking, virtually everyone is high IQ, so on down the line. There aren't the other separators that you normally see. But
Mm.
I mean, wokeness, when I've seen it in practice, generally consists of some lower IQ form of Marxism with the rich man replaced as the big bad by something else.
Right.
And like, there are people I've met that are very smart that are on the left, like Sam Hedley, bro, that would debate you for a couple hours over a beer. Like, what are you talking about? Like, they're whole things like systems of production that you need to find analogs for here. But at a simple, like, honors high school seminar level, this is an exactly accurate description. So in Marxism or communism, the core idea is that society is structured to benefit a certain group, the ruling class, the rich, so that institutions that look facially neutral, like the laws of property ownership, are in fact designed to benefit rich people. And this goes on and on for chapters. I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
this traces back even pre-Marx to ideas that are very popular on the left, like Rousseau's theory of the origin of property and so on down the line. And that's that. That's the framework.
Right.
In Black studies, it would be pretty accurate, between 90 and 100% accurate, to say that they've just kicked out the rich man and put in the white man. So
Mm.
society is structured to benefit white people. White
Right.
privilege exists in virtually every interaction. White names are privileged on applications for jobs with virtually every business. Whiteness is the beauty standard. By the way, a lot of this is empirically testable. Asian and exotic Black women both seem to be seen as more attractive than white women, and most men seem willing to sleep with virtually any women. I mean, so like when you actually test this, a lot of it's just BS. Again,
I don't need to study to know that.
don't need the docs running around the nightclub at the end of the. I mean, like, there are a bunch of studies of this, though. I mean, like, there's a
Yeah.
famous study that was done by a bunch of feminists that wanted to prove that women were as sexually aggressive as men, that you've probably heard of. But they sent very attractive men and women to kind of bar nightclub environments, like the sort of places where we have tables outside. And they went up to a number of people, it's like 100 apiece. You had to quote it. It'd be an awkward job as a research assistant, gain a huge reputation as a slut and get slapped a lot for $5 an hour or whatever. But I mean, they
Yeah.
went up to people and they said, like, it's been a real party night for me. I mean, my God, you're so beautiful. I just want to take you home. I want to fuck your brains out. I don't do this often. Let's do it once. Are you down or not? And the men who did this to the women, out of like 100 tries, got like 4 acceptances, which I'm sure was enough for them. Like, consent was there. But the women who did this to the men got like 48 acceptances.
Mm-hmm.
And the men that said no were divided between just like insecure kind of losers, or like real issues that just got home from the army, like not down with that, or they were married and they were
Married.
actually,
Yeah.
they were like loyal. But I mean, so it was just this huge difference that was found. But I guess the point is that you can actually, and 48 might be low. I'd have to check the data. But the point is that you can actually test woke theories and they're always wrong. But
Mm.
at any rate, Black studies, kind of getting to the point, is race Marxism. You take the dominant group at the peak of the constructed system and you replace rich with Black. I would argue that later fourth wave feminism, so on, women's studies, you take the dominant group and you replace rich with male. So why do they call it the cockpit? Society is constructed for the benefit of men. Marriage is a ritual designed to enslave men, to get men as much sex as possible, to keep women in the kitchen, barefoot and pregnant. Now, again, the first line of that might sound like a joke to many men, but so forth. Queer
Yeah.
theory. Society is structured around a traditionalist idea of the warrior male, marginalized sexual identities like female bisexuality or shoved to the sidelines, etc. And you can do this with almost anything. That's the
Right.
wonderful thing about it. So you're now seeing the rise of like fat studies. You're now
Yeah, yeah.
seeing the rise of trans and age queer and so on theories. So there's no limit to the number of potential revolutionaries because there's no limit to the number of personalities that can become identities.
Wow. That's one of those things. I do podcasts all the time. And then there's always one or two lines from the podcast where I'll be like, you know, that meme where you're just like eyes open when your brain is like, hey, what about what Wilfred said today about how there's no limit to revolutionaries? Yeah, I guess I don't know what the nobody knows, but how this all plays out, because it does seem, one of my questions is there anything redeemable or salvageable about this ideology, or is it something that must be eradicated?
Well, I mean, I think it has to be. I don't think you can eradicate an idea, really. I mean, so this is.
I mean,
I'm actually.
eradicated in the way that it's being institutionalized, because there is a lot of this stuff that is finding its way into our institutions.
Uh, I think what I would say here is that normal people, and I think one thing that strikes me about both me and you when we were talking about like going to clubs just now is that we seem to be fairly normal people. Like normal motherfuckers. That's the only time I'm
Yeah.
gonna like use hard profanity in this bracket. But like normal people need to get together and oppose crazy people. So I mean, I think there are two levels to this. First, the extent to which nonsense, and again, like I just defined, a lot of CRT or Black studies as race Marxism. I'm using kind of a broad but accurate label here. The extent to which woke nonsense has been entrenched in educational curricula would surprise a hell of a lot of people. So, I mean,
Mhm.
I just finished writing a book called hypothetically something like Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You, which is a response to that whole Howard Zinn genre of, a people's history of the United States, lies
Right.
your teacher told you, lies of jingo history, all that stuff that came out in the late 60s, early 70s, that's sort of asking, well, how did you guys do from, the time period between then and now when the center left controlled the educational system? Have you been telling the truth? And one of the things that I discovered writing that book is, again, you can use terms like CRT, however you want to describe it. One of the things I discovered is that extreme left-wing critical activism is extraordinarily prevalent in kind of the mainstream classroom. So like
Mhm.
the 1619 project from the New York Times, which began as like a magazine supplement for upper middle class housewives, like which argues that slavery is the thing that really began the United States, like just a little bit to the right of Castro. I mean, they have an educational curriculum. It starts in like second grade. And
Right.
there's this whole list of terms you need to learn, like affirmative action and whipping post. Um, and the site is actually kind of disturbing. Like they're one of the add-ons to the 1619 project site is this list of regional projects with names like the 1857 project, where individual school districts can kind of chronicle the racial tensions and troubles in their own area. At the most basic level, the 1619 project, the Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery. Everything unique about the USA came out of our historical slavocracy. Racism is in the country's DNA.
Right.
Slavery made the country rich, all this utter nonsense. I mean, that is one of the more popular educational curricula for young kids. The Zen Education Center, which, as I understand, is frankly Marx's Zen Education Project. Sorry, they have another youth education curriculum, which goes back to like fourth grade. So, yes, I think that there are open attempts to get this stuff into every level of education. And then, I mean, when you get into college, there's an incredibly one-sided slant in the academy. I
Mhm.
mean, I'm pretty good. I'm a good junior academic, but I'm probably one of like the 30 most prominent conservative professors in the country, which really says something. But what it says is that there aren't that many of us. I
Right.
mean, like if you look at sociology, kind of last sentence here, but Like, I looked at the data in a new paper that came out recently. They were breaking down fields by Democratic versus Republican registration. And in sociology, I'm not making this up, it was like 69-0, with like the rest of the gap being made up with left-leaning independents, Greens, so on down the line. So yes, I absolutely think that there's an attempt to get these ideologies into every aspect of what you think of as discourse, like secondary education, higher
Mm,
education, media. Um,
law.
and I'm sorry.
Law.
Oh yeah, that's the big one. And I actually, by the way, I think that's how we're going to effectively fight back. If you talk to people like Gabs Clark, or you talk to some of the detransitioners and the gender side, like
Right,
Chloe
right.
Cole. Like, I think if one poor white mom sues and is like, my Appalachian daughter was told that she is a, you know, member of an oppressor class and all this other stuff. I mean, like that girl's gonna win $1 million. Like if one woman one girl who had her clitoris cut off comes into court and is like, and just does the whole thing, like, my feminist lawyer will now explain the sexual function of a clitoris. And this just
Yes,
goes on and on for days. Like, this is what a double mastectomy is. And you
right,
perform this on a minor? Yes, a
right.
17-year-old is a technical minor. Why? Because the 17-year-old told us she was a boy. I think, like, when this is done, that's going to be how this stuff is utterly cut out of a lot of systems. Just risk aversion on the part of these punk ass bougie middle class leaders that are going to have to make these calls from then on. But yeah, I'm a bit of a long talker, but yeah, like, this stuff's definitely in there. And as a final comment on that, when people say like Ron DeSantis or like a middle of the road Democratic governor like the guy in Colorado, when they say he banned Black history, no, the fuck he didn't. That always means like there's some kind of curriculum where like a third of it is Black Lives Matter. I mean, I actually read the curriculum that was temporarily banned in Florida, and it was like a Black, queer, trans, experiential journey through our country's history. And it's like, I don't really think Booker T. Washington was gay, bro. Like, it seems like you're taking a lot of modern, nonsensical ideas, like, we explore feminist ethical sluttiness on the plantation. And it's sort of like, I don't really think that's what fifth graders need to hear about. What was Harriet Tubman up to? So whenever you hear
Yeah.
that something was banned, it's always something of that nature.
Okay. How did you end up were you raised conservative, or is it something you landed on? How did you end up being, of the right, as you say?
Well, I don't necessarily think I'm extraordinarily conservative now, if I can explore that. So I told you I was talking to this literary agent, and we were pitching
Right.
kind of a true crimer, a bit of a blood and gore storyline. And the guy was like, I think it's great you're kind of in that anti-woke space and you're kind of, keeping them honest. And it's weird because I don't feel like there's a place for me to go, like in publishing in a lot of fields, you know, and and I don't want to give any impression of who this guy is. I don't know if this will be the final agent that we end up working with on the book or anything like that. It's just a personal buddy of mine. But there's a lot of this crazy stuff, like you're identifying yourself by your pronouns and your race
Mhm.
before every meeting, right? This
Mhm.
sort of thing. But on the other hand, like, I'm not sending my daughter to, Hillsdale College. Like,
Right.
I feel like a lot of the effective resistance to this stuff comes from people that this is him talking, think are crazy. Like, I'm not really messing with Matt Walsh when it comes to women's rights. I don't think that week old fetuses are human beings that we should baptize and name. So
Mm,
this guy is saying, like, this is crazy over here. But I think, and this is why there wasn't a red wave, by the way. Like, I
right.
mean, people are trying to complicate this. The election came, what, 3 weeks after national abortion rights vanished. Like, I
Right.
do some political consulting, and I actually refused to take money for my predictions on this one because it was so absurdly simple. Like,
Right.
many people are saying, I would like to be able to get a DNC through the first 2 months, but I
Mhm.
also don't believe that since I can get an abortion, I'm a dude. So there's that large space in the middle. My point is that I think that there are a large number of groups, and this is me almost talking in business mode now, that are rising to fill that. So, for example, I'm
Mm,
an executive. I'm a member of the advisory board for FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, which
hmm.
is, I mean, Barry Weiss is one of the founders there, Bjorn Bartnig, Angel Eduardo,
Yep.
Daryl
I love
Davis, the
Angel.
guy who's dehooded all those Klansmen. I mean,
Hmm.
all those
Hmm.
people that together are saying, well, we certainly oppose traditional racism. And we're going to
Right.
file a brief if there's a black teacher that's being abused, that sort of thing. But we also oppose all the white kids in the class being made to quote unquote privilege walk. Like we oppose
Hmm.
racism. We oppose people being made to do things on the basis of their race. So
Right.
that's just straight down the line Martin Luther King colorblindness. And
Right.
I can guarantee you, looking at those donor lists, 90% of white Americans, 85% of black Americans are going to support that idea. I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
there's FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, now just the Foundation for Individual Rights, right? They're
Yeah.
saying,
Greg's been
yeah,
on.
what's up?
Greg has been on. Greg Lukinoff.
Oh yeah, Lukinov's a great guy, but it's just sort of
Yeah.
like, well, if the ACLU is just going to be on complete bullshit, like if they're going to start saying things like hate speech isn't speech, like on Twitter, well,
Yeah.
we're going to come back at them and we're going to take that donor list. So
Right.
I mean, FIRE is in the mix. I'm a member of 1776 Unites, which is the Black business and social science community's response to the 1619 Project, which was Bob Woodson, Glenn Lowry, Coleman Hughes,
Yeah.
John McWhorter. So, I mean, I think a lot of people are looking for a place where they see a bunch of other sane people, maybe with a tie on for the gentleman, kind of saying, no, what you're saying is crazy. Um,
Yeah.
and that is now being established. And I think those groups are going to play a bigger role. I'm a broy guy. I like Matt Walsh, but I think that there's probably going to be a bigger role played by, say, FAIR long term than by Patrick Henry College when it comes to getting some of this stuff out of the institutions. But does it have to be gotten out of the institutions? Yes, not so much because it's woke, but because it's biased nonsense.
Right.
And I guess my position is that I actually don't want biased nonsense in the educational curriculum.
Right.
Colin Wright, who's a buddy of mine and who again is tied into a bunch of this stuff, the owner of Reality's Last
Yep.
Stand, he got
He's been on.
involved. Yeah, we know a lot of these people. I mean, you're
Yeah.
involved in some of these fights. So there's this whole bunch of like normal citizens who have not failed in our businesses, who are not unsuccessful in our personal lives, who are like life, but who also are saying like Colin got involved because he opposed the extreme Christian presence at the time. And I think Texas, Indiana, some of these districts, I mean, people were openly arguing for the teaching of creationism. And he said no. And now 10 years later, he's saying, well, again, like the joking line I used, people are saying some women have 9-inch penises. And he's once again saying, this smacks of creationism to me.
Yeah.
This smacks of
Yeah.
the two lions that both have manes walking on the boat in the illustration. And
Yeah.
so the resistance grows again. Some people just don't want to hear nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very true. Although I think anyone now who is in that fight gets labeled as right wing, whether they hold those beliefs or not. And you were saying you don't feel like you're conservative or right wing, but earlier in the podcast you did kind of say you were a right wing professor. You're one of the few people who would be a conservative professor in the country, or right. I don't know if you consider yourself conservative or right wing or
Yeah,
what.
good redirect after my 10-minute conversation about something else.
No,
No, so first of all, I don't like run from that title at all. I think that
yeah,
most most men over about 35 who have spent some time in the business world are pretty conservative. And
yeah.
I would describe myself as about center right. I don't
Mhm.
mind being called conservative, but I mean, in terms of the label right wing, I don't see myself as a movement conservative really at all. And I
Right.
don't I don't have any objection to that. Like when I mentioned like Matt or Ben Shapiro, I'm very friendly with online. Actually, who I like a lot as a guy. I'd have no objection to working with them on a project. I'd have no objection to working for the Daily Wire. Actually, this wasn't really a joke. Actually, during the recent thing with Steven Crowder, I said online, Crowder had been pitched $50 million. Was like, no, these are slave wages.
Yeah.
And it was like, bro. But I mean, I said online, like, this would be like triple my projections for X period of time. I was like, if you pay me $10 million over 4 years, I'll sell out, come work for you. You know, I'll
Yeah.
make a movie about Black conservatism or something. And I will tell you, not them, but other people reached out in response to that and were like, what about 5? And it was like, no, I said who I'd sell out to, and I said the amount. Get out of here. But anyway,
Like,
so
take your 5 million and get out.
bum.
Yeah.
So, but at any rate,
Prager.
so
Just
very
kidding.
friendly relationship there. I have no problem with the American right wing. Great on a good number of issues. Great on fatherhood, family. But I mean, in terms of my own personal view on a bunch of issues, I mean, I am not, to say the least, a devout religious Christian. If I
Mhm.
had a spiritual patron, it would be Athena or Coyote, probably.
Coyote's
Um,
mine.
Coyote?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Trickster.
Coyote's one of the best
Always
gods out
trickster.
there. Yeah.
Definitely.
No, that's right. A lot of that's good to know. We have to
Yeah.
keep we coyotes have to keep an eye on each other. But
True.
but no, like just a lot of this other stuff. The extreme anti-sex attitude on both the hard right and the woke left. Now, I agree with you, by the way. I think a lot of people regret their bar and club slut phase. But
Mhm.
like some of this stuff people are saying, like the age gaps in relationships are problematic. You shouldn't drink wine on your third date. Like the stuff that you hear on the internet is just ridiculous, like 1950s chaperonage
Yeah,
nonsense.
yeah.
Abortion, I think, is really one of these issues where you have to have some coherent understanding of not just DNA, but personhood. Like, there are actually very good MRI scan tests for sapiens right now. So, like,
Mm.
I mean, I posted a picture of a blastocyst on we're probably both good enough with computers to pull it up on the screen right now, but it seems like a little too much work. But it's just like the circle. It's like
Uh-huh.
full 2 weeks in, fully fertilized. And I put that on my Twitter, and I was like, look, if there's any health issue, or even if there isn't, I don't think this is a person. Do you? Like, are you really banning a pill that terminates this? And all these people were saying things like, I would give that a name. Like, yes,
Yeah.
that is a human being. And it's, I simply don't agree with that. I don't think that's a logical position. I think that position comes from a purely religious place where you think that there is a soul inherent in that little being. Um, so a lot of things of this kind, I'm not really down the rock slide with the hard right on. And yeah, so I mean, oh, actually, I'll give a what I'm for as opposed to what I'm against. When I say I'm kind of a center right businessman with a gun, that sort of thing, my my core attitude is that shit has to work.
Right.
So I grew up as a kid in a Black and Irish neighborhood in like Chicago, as I suspect you grew up in an actual city. And a lot of things just didn't work.
Right.
Like, I mean, I grew up in a single mom household, and this is the 80s. Everyone was a latchkey kid. So I would like get on the train with my skateboard. I wasn't a gangbanger. I was kind of a nerdy athlete. But like it just nothing was functional. Like people would get on the train and start painting graffiti. They'd have like the
Yeah.
big black and gold markers and they'd start writing their names on the windows. People would get on the train and start having sex, like high school couples and so on. Like
I feel like we're
bums
back to this.
what's up?
I feel like we're back to this in a lot of cities.
Yeah, yeah, it's ridiculous, man. Citizens have to just start kicking people's ass, like just mace people if they just start committing crimes within your vicinity. Not otherwise, of course. But like bums would live on the train, homeless individuals, whatever you're supposed to call them. But like people would have like tarps over 2 seats,
Yeah.
and it just struck me. And these are things we all saw in the 80s and 90s in Chicago, New York, Boston. I mean, there are entire neighborhoods you couldn't go to. I
Yeah.
remember I was in the park once. We were playing basketball. One of my guys was with me. We were like 13. This wasn't even Chicago. This was in Aurora. And like he pricked himself on something on the ground, and everyone freaked out. We're like, you have to go to the hospital right now because it was a needle. So, I mean, we did. Fortunately, he didn't get AIDS, but that
Yeah.
was a pretty frequent risk. Like
Yeah.
the fresh blood on a lot of things. This also, by the way, there was no cure for AIDS at the time. So
Yeah.
AIDS was an extremely big worry. It affected people's hookup patterns. We all thought Magic Johnson was going to die. So, I
Yeah.
mean, like, you can't have that. You can't have cities with like Kinshasa, Zaire rates of STD death where people are shooting at each other out of the windows of cars. So, I mean,
That's LA right now.
it really is. I mean, like, you're seeing a lot of gonzo journalism right now is just MFs walking around. Like, whether it's Andy No with like the white riot scene in Portland, or it's
Yeah.
the guys that are doing that with like the black gangs in LA, it's just a guy taking a camera and going to his old hood and doing this. Like, it's not like, I travel a lot to give speeches, and like to get to Skid Row in like, I won't name the city, but I was in a West Coast city recently for a speech, and someone asked me after the event, like, just one of the guys at the bar downstairs, like, "Hey, do you want to get some coke?" And I was like, I don't really party like that in this phase of my life, but like, where would that happen? He was like, outside. Like, all you have to do is walk a block down the street. And I mean, there's like an entire community of people selling drugs openly and like living
Yeah.
in tents. People
Yep.
have dogs. It was just the most ridiculous thing in the world. When I was in
It's
Minneapolis,
crazy.
yeah, no, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's really weird to see in American cities. I mean, that sort of bizarre squalor. Like, I was recently asked to give a speech at the American Society of Engineering Education conference, and myself and one of the engineers, this young Turkish guy, wanted to go to George Floyd Square. So we just hopped in a cab and went up there. And this like 3 block area has been fenced off city state style. So there are like guards at the borders. There's a
Yeah.
giant sheet metal fist in the middle of the area. The pictures are still up on my Twitter. And we were both wearing suits from the conference. So the people there gave us a lot of negative respect. Like, they
Right.
assumed we were some kind of fighting men from the state, like detectives. So they were saying things to us like, yeah, we're peaceful. We ain't committing crimes. It's daytime, which sounded kind of ominous to me. But like, tell O'Leary, we good, all this kind of crap. And it just the one thing I noticed was that there were still citizens stuck in there. Like, only
Right.
half the houses had been abandoned. So there were people like sitting on their porches, like smoking pipes, even mix of blacks and whites, while all this went on. Like, so there's
Yeah.
like a thieves market in a parking lot here, or maybe they were legal goods, who knows? And then there's just like this old guy doing the wash, and then there's like the giant sheet metal fist.
It's so wild. I used to live in Minneapolis, and in that neighbor, like a couple miles away from the precinct that got burned down, and that area in particular is really, dear to my heart. It's where after I got a rehab, I was there. So I lived in this apartment that was all those businesses I used to frequent, and I donated to the Lake Street Council to just help them rebuild after all of the riots and whatnot. And I got something recently this summer, an email, and it was like, we're doing another raising of money to blah blah. I was like, they're still trying to rebuild. Where are the stories about this? I don't see any stories about how in this neighborhood in Minneapolis that was primarily Black-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses, they're still holding fundraisers to rebuild 2
Yeah,
years after the fact.
it was the city's primary Asian and Black business district. I mean,
Yeah.
this is so right now in the social sciences, we've become weirdly attached to this one magic variable of racism as the explanation for why things happen. And
Mhm.
I actually am not resistant to the idea that racism can sometimes explain some things. So I
Right.
think that poor whites and poor blacks are treated about equally if you look at the justice system, or treatment in jail, depending on the percentage of the population of your race in that jail, because
Right.
prisoners also are notably abuse one another. But I
Right.
mean, there are more poor blacks than poor whites because of past abuse. Okay, sure.
Right.
But I mean, there are obviously other variables that come into play that are just sort of ignored, with the results of those other variables being farmed off on racism in a silly and amateurish fashion. So, like,
Mm.
this is a clear example. Like, so for my most recent book, I started looking at what happened to American cities in the 1960s and 70s.
Mhm.
And so we often see that there are these glaring, horrible problems in the Black community. I mean, for example, there's an illegitimacy, or if you prefer, an out of wedlock birth rate of like 70% in the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
There's a crime rate that's 2.2 times the white crime rate, which is really high compared
Right.
to other first world countries, and so on down the line. And it's very often heard to the point where it's become a cliche that this is the legacy of slavery and so on. And in kind of the heterodox quantitative community that we're both involved in, we all know that's sort of not true. This began really in the 1960s and 70s. And yeah, welfare
Right.
played a role. But another thing that played a role was the destruction of the big cities. And until I
Mm.
started writing the book, I didn't know the extent to which this was true. But I mean, again, following both the Weathermen stuff among working class white kids and especially the Martin Luther King riots in 67 and 68, 20 or 30 of the nation's largest cities had 50 plus city blocks, I think was the cutoff I used in the book, destroyed. I mean,
Wow.
Detroit was one of the most successfully integrated big cities in the country. So whites and blacks there hadn't just discovered one another. That was Motown. You had salt and pepper jazz bands.
Yeah.
You had for decades. What happened was that integrated groups of youths burned down half of the city. And so businesses, any businesses that could, and those unfortunately were more likely to be white businesses, fled the city. And there's been almost this concentrated attempt to pretend that something else happened. The
Mm.
suburbs lured them away. There were other problems, just all these crazy excuses. Lead paint was somehow
Right.
correlated with an increase in crime and maybe even with the riots. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that we're now seeing the same shit now.
Yeah.
Like, Lake Street was literally one of the more successful Asian American and Black American business districts in the country. During the George Floyd riots, a mob, which was mostly white, by the way,
Yep.
progress, but a mob burned it down.
I
Like half
know.
yeah, I mean, and of course it hasn't recovered. I mean, there's 2/3 of it's still gone.
Yeah.
But so when you ask, well, why is this a food desert? Well, it's a food desert because you guys, or at least your white ex and her friends, set the stores on fire. I mean, so it's just this refusal to ever hold anyone responsible for anything. Like you can
Yeah.
debate whether it's like the black locals or their white buddies, but somebody burnt down the many successful businesses that were there, which is why there were no longer successful businesses there.
I will never forget just how wild it was in LA watching all of that shit go down. We were just watching local news, and to be fair, KTLA did like a really great job just having people all over the city, and they were just reporting live and they were bouncing back and forth between all these reporters. And it was like clockwork in downtown Santa Monica on the promenade. It was just some white kid with a little hammer would go it seemed so coordinated, would go smash the window, or two white kids, dressed in all black, and you're just watching this live with the cameras
Mhm.
recording, and then you see these two kids run up, smash the glass, like the doors or the windows, and then there's just a mob of primarily black young kids just
Mhm.
runs in, and they're going just hitting store to store to store, and they were stopping and interviewing these people, and two of the people that they interviewed had no idea who George Floyd even was. They were just didn't know. They weren't, they were just like, "Ah, we just got like a group chat and wanted some new sneakers." Like
Yeah, I
it
don't mean
was
to make fun of it as a black dude, but like, yeah, I could totally see that. Like, if you actually watch riot footage, like someone being like, "Yeah, the nigga George Floyd, he a real one," and then like running into a store and running out with a bag of J's, like, there's
It was I don't even think I think it's just like it was in the lockdowns, people were pent up. It was a lot of these were kids, like 17-year-old kids who were just seemed like they were bored, and they were like, hey, everybody's rioting. Let's go." And that was it was just wild to watch. I mean, even the people who were covering it were like, "What is going on?" You could see and they're still not like downtown hasn't recovered. A lot of the stores left, a lot of the big stores left. It created this atmosphere in this city of a kind of lawlessness. LA is already very lawless, even from everybody. I'm not talking any race. Nobody really obeys traffic laws here. Nobody, it's still very a Wild West town. And now it feels even more so like that in the aftermath of all of this, because I think people know that there's a certain amount you can get away with. If you can get away with, I mean, we used to, what are all those studies about like graffiti? This is like that times a million.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's true to some extent in a lot of big cities. That was really what people started cracking down on in the 1990s with broken windows.
Mm,
So it wasn't that they went after the big gang kingpins. It was that they would stop people doing all the city stuff, like
right.
peeing outside, making out outside, smashing windows, tagging just their
Mhm.
name, not any kind of portrait art. The big one in New York was just jumping turnstiles. Like I remember this was another thing in Chicago, like no one would pay to get on the train. Like, even when I was canvassing, and this was doing activism, like, when I was in college, this was years later, like, people would always just be like, "Hey, can I get behind you?" This would be like, I was usually, like, the leader of the crew, like, the sales crew, so someone would put their arms around me. I mean, this would usually be someone female, they'd, like, sneak in through the tunnel with me. The next guy would, like, jump over the thing. Like, of 5 people, 1 would pay, and in New York, they would station cops behind the turnstiles, and if you jumped over the turnstile, they would arrest you. And they wouldn't beat you and they wouldn't even take you to jail, but they would take you downtown to booking and they would charge you $150 or whatever. So gradually people got used to the idea that there was law again. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, I think cities should probably start doing that again, but they're doing the reverse. With the kids in the George Floyd thing, when you're talking about, and I mean there are a lot of jokes you could make, like, oh, the white guy had the hammer and the black guys had the bags, diversity. But I mean, like, in reality, I think one of the problems here is that the journalists and the social scientists are trying to shoehorn basically just punk ass criminals,
Right.
like 2 buddies from the basketball team who happen to be of different races, into like this pre-planned narrative. Like this
Right.
is an upsurge of revolutionary violence after they killed the brother George. And the reality is just if you don't enforce the law, people will commit crimes. Like
Right.
the reality is George Floyd himself came very close to having a drug overdose before bad policing did kill him. Like there's a
Right.
there's a complex, messed up story even there. People are
Yes.
rioting because you're giving them leeway to riot. Like also all those places where there were George Floyd's riots, like George Floyd wasn't from there. So,
Yeah.
like, I understood Minneapolis, where George Floyd was sort of a popular guy. But when I started seeing the Floyd riots break out in like Hispanic communities in Phoenix, you sort of understand, like, yeah, there's an element of people just going out taking stuff. And if
Right.
there were more cops in front of the mall where people are going to take stuff from, there'd be less stuff taken. Like, there's a brutal, amoral reality to a lot of things.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they were breaking out like all over there were protests and whatnot all over the world. I've talked to people on the podcast who aren't from America and they're like, why did we have a George Floyd protest here?
No, I mean, they had a George Floyd protest in Stockholm, I believe, like in
Yeah.
Sweden. They had one in South Africa, which is currently run by the black majority, which is
Yeah.
apparently mistreating the white minority. So that's deeply ironic. I mean, just on and on and on down the line. Like there's a human tendency, and to a certain extent, it's fun to fight in the street and dance around. So
Yeah.
when people were given that opportunity, they took it. And I'm sure you're right. COVID obviously played a role. The only thing you could do was riot. The
Yeah.
health authorities had actually approved your
Yeah.
rioting. So, like, you saw that crazy CNN letter signed by 3,000 doctors or whatever saying this is safe to do.
Yeah, the
That
protest.
actually, probably one of my latter comments here, but like that was one of the things that really quote unquote red pilled a lot of my normie friends.
So many. So I get letters from the politically homeless all the time, and around that, we ask for people for their whatever pilled moment, red, purple, blue, And the number one cited kind of red pill moment for people was being locked down, not being able to go to graduations, funerals, people dying alone, not having kids not go to school, having to shut down their businesses. I mean, we could go on and on and on with this list. And then having a bunch of doctors sanction protests in the middle of this pandemic. It was like, people are still mad about that, rightfully. You know, they had every right to be furious. And
Yeah, I guess to me, and again, I don't want to say too many just openly cynical things, but it, I've never really believed all that much. Like,
yeah.
I mean, I grew up in the hood. You know, I pulled myself out of it using a variety of techniques. I've worked in a range of these environments like sales floors where like open competitiveness is accepted and expected. Like I said, my god of choice would be Coyote. So I mean,
Yeah.
like I think that I expect the lords of society to be lying much of the time.
Yeah.
And I also have a reliance on numbers and a skill with them that enables me, like bullshit aside, to be able to frequently look at things and see what the truth is without too much horn tooting.
Mm,
So, I mean, I didn't really change my behavior very much during COVID at all.
yeah, I
Like,
didn't
I am,
either.
yeah, I don't think a lot of people, not like us, but that had similar presets did. In
Right.
fact, I'll tell you just up front, I don't. None of my buddies did, and I don't think that most people did. So, like, there was a moment that really, to me, clarified the class divide. I was talking with one of the friends that I've mentioned before during this episode, who's like an Italian American guy who's from the east side of Aurora, and I asked him how he was handling lockdown, assuming at least in the sense that I was at home an hour or two more a day. And he was like, I'm not locked down. You know, we're building roads out here. Like we work the same amount of
Yeah.
hours. And I mean, like almost everything, like liquor stores, grocery stores, the Italian market, every place that I would go is open because it's an essential business. Like, and then
Yeah.
he gave me like some joke, like you college boys, you know, those may be inessential jobs, but like almost everything, I think the bars were open in his community. Like
That's
everything
hilarious.
is essential. So that
Yeah.
entire class of people that like delivered the food
Yeah.
to the New York Times reporters crying at home. None of
Yeah.
those people changed anything during the entire period of COVID-19. So, I mean, I guess like, where I'm going with this, I guess, is that I wasn't all that shocked and horrified when I saw the CNN statement because I thought that the panic about COVID was overblown in the first place.
Mhm.
And what I did to try to, in response to COVID, was to kind of try to protect seniors.
Mhm.
Like you saw countries like Sweden that were basically following the Great Barrington Declaration, they were doing that.
Right.
It seemed to make a lot of sense. In my own life, I was at no risk. I
Yeah.
mean, Jane, the woman that was living with me, was at no risk.
Yeah.
My none of my buddies were. So it was there wasn't a whole lot to be done. So I wasn't outraged when they were like, you can go party. Because in Appalachia, I mean, there were people that had been partying since the start. There were people
Yeah.
that were throwing catch COVID parties. So, but
Ye
nonetheless, like I agree that if you had actually been following all of the rules, like if you had if you had been staying home to save lives for like 7 months, and then you saw the people that you had believed in putting out a flyer that said, yes, you can go riot because racism is the real pandemic. Yeah, I can see you wanting to burn it all down
it
appropriately.
Yeah, I think that it was weird for me because my husband was quote unquote an essential worker. He jokes about that because he was working at a grocery store. So
Cool.
we never had, like, he came and went every day. You know, he was working, looking at all the different protocols they were trying to deal with, watching people spray down their stuff, but he was always in touch with the public, so we never could lock down. We just wanted to make sure to, like you said, be careful of like the seniors in our lives. And because we were always constantly being exposed, and then he left that job and got a job in recovery. So again, working with particularly men who are living in houses with each other, that like, 10, 15 guys, and then coming and running groups. So we just never like lost our minds about it, because we took whatever precautions. Mostly we had to obey a lot of really stupid laws. I watched most of the small businesses, many of them, close. And I think in the blue states during that time, we went on a road trip to Texas, and that was just a stark reminder. We were in Arizona, and it was like there was no COVID. We were at a bar, everybody was out. There were kids playing with beanbag game, and they're all passing them around. It was like it was so crazy going from Los Angeles, which was very locked down. No one was even and to like these red states. And I came back, and people talk in the blue states like that is the only reality. And I was like, guys, do you know that there are states right next to us that aren't living like this? They did in Utah, they shut down for 2 weeks, and then they were back in school. Kids were back in school that fall.
And the thing about this is, I wrote an article about this, not quite for a journal, but for Spike, the big men's magazine in the
Uh-huh.
UK, like 5 months in, and there was no difference in death rates, like at all. Like I told you when we were, it was crazy. Like when we were talking about the vaccine, the only thing that affected COVID death, well, first of all, the death rates were a lot worse in the blue states because they kept doing crazy shit. They kept, because they didn't want to like commit age discrimination or whatever, they kept shipping dying people into nursing homes.
I know, that was
They
nuts.
did want to commit race discrimination. They kept staggering care and doing all this other stuff. So the blue states were doing way, way worse than the red states because they refused to accept this basic reality that the only people that were really at risk were these very old, very sick people. The other thing that like the libs refuse to accept about COVID is that the thing that makes you very susceptible to COVID is being weak. Like it's being fat, it's being out of shape, it's not being
Right.
tan, it's not working out. So that it's not eating meat, it's not taking vitamin D, and they just refuse to say this. Like
Yeah.
absolutely refuse to. And so I mean, as a result, many people died.
Yeah.
They were like shoveling sand into the skate parks and covering, like
Oh,
breaking the
I
basketball
know.
hoops. And I mean, in the meantime, the red states were telling people to go outside and play. I mean,
Mhm.
there was uh, nothing really was done in terms of panicking about schools or whatever, but there was a focus on do it a little more outdoors if you can. And so, if anything, there was less death. The whole blue state reaction through the early part of the pandemic was just unnecessary kabuki. Like a certain number
Yeah.
of old people were going to die, but there were always going to be things you could do, like have nursing home workers work in shifts. Like
Yeah.
all the stuff about young children and so on was just completely meaningless. Like you can disagree with me and say, like, well, a child could get sick and could get a mom sick, and then that could get a grandmother sick, who could get a great grandmother sick. But like the thing is, you can look at the death rates, and the death rates were worse in the blue states. The only thing that changed that was the weird Republican reaction to the vaccine. But like for a year and a half, people just tortured themselves for no reason.
Yeah, I lived through it. It was really wild. And then we went to South Africa when the South African
That's cool.
strain.
Oh,
What?
okay. Oh, I
It
said
was
that's
like,
cool.
yeah, it was during the peak. We went on our honeymoon, and it was like literally that week was when the South African strain was in the news. And we just still went because everybody told us not to go. You're going to get the South African strain. You're going to die in South Africa. What if you get COVID in South Africa? And they handled it. They seemed to have it so much more organized and dialed in South Africa than we did in LA. They handled it so much more reasonably, but everybody was still going about their lives. The only thing you saw was just how absolutely decimated that country had been from Western policies about COVID, which made me crazy, shutting down airlines, even though South Africa was just doing the research before everybody else. And they're like, we're being punished for finding new strains, even though these strains are already identified in other European countries. We just discovered it, then you named it after us, and now you're shutting down all the flights here. It was crazy. That was crazy to see.
Yeah, the other thing, I mean, Africa also, like if you talk honestly with an African leader, and we've tried to book some on Cut the Bull and some of the other like black media I've done, like most of them didn't take COVID all that seriously. Like if you look at major countries like Nigeria, where they certainly have the tech, I mean, they provide a lot of our software engineers, where they certainly have the tech to like keep track of each death. They were like, look, one, we have real diseases, and two, it looks like our total number of deaths is like 30,000. Like the average, I mean, we're a civilized country now, but the average life expectancy here is like 69. We're not
Right.
losing a lot of people. So this panic, part of the panic about COVID in the USA came from the fact that we're such an unnatural society in human terms.
Mm,
So like our age of death is now like 81, 82. So
right.
like the average age of death from COVID in the USA, and I know this, I really looked into the Kentucky data, was able to look at some files over the years, but was 80 or 81. So like it was right at the time a human was going to die. Now, people will still say, well, nonetheless, the bug took off 2 or 3 years of your life. But a lot of this panic was about, can we keep people alive this extra 2 or 3 years after they get this?
Yeah.
45% of all COVID deaths were in nursing homes. Another thing was how fat Americans are. Like where you
Yeah.
see stuff like supersized salon, where like a
Yeah.
percent or more of the population's over 600 pounds. So I mean, like when you saw like a young person die of COVID, you never want to ask this, but it's the question is,
No.
well, how much did they weigh?
I
Like
know.
it's
I
never gonna
know.
be someone who's 18 and 114 who's on the swim team. So it's like we were hit very hard because of this. Also, one other variable I do have to trot out though, many other countries were just flat out lying. Like
Right.
China shot up to like 60,000 COVID deaths. And then they kicked out the WHO inspectors, who, for all their bullshit, do a good job. And then they were stable at 60,000 COVID deaths for like 5 months. The
Yeah.
actual total was probably like 80% of ours. And like
Yeah.
everybody knows that political scientists were counting the number of cremation urns they were ordering. So
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
why did they in North Korea have no deaths? Well, because they just made up their numbers. And
Right.
that's something we forget when we look at totals for anything in those countries, prison population, AIDS.
Yeah, it's been such a like wild and wacky time to be alive, and I do feel like even now you and I were just tweeting about our jokes, and I retweeted you, and people are like, well, maybe if they hadn't been so, it was the reverse for so many years, and now we're just mad and salty, and so there's just so, and this is where I feel like I really relate to you because you're kind of a coyote and you recognize like the absurdity of life. And I recently heard about a woman my age who got like a very rare cancer and she's dying. Like there's so many things that are so horrible and tragic. And some of the stuff that we all go back and forth about is a little bit absurd, but like the grievance culture that we live in, the society of just like everyone being perpetually offended
Oh
and
yeah.
aggrieved is, I hope we grow out of this, or I don't know. And again, maybe it's just Gen X. Like I don't identify with that at all. I feel it makes me feel like a boomer or something. Just I don't identify with that aspect of our culture of just walking around feeling like the world owes me anything.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. I don't feel owed. I don't feel other people are obligated to give me anything, which is a pretty good baseline. Which also, I mean, from the left and even nowadays the right is an unusual position. Like I follow Nina Turner online
Yeah.
because she's like a funny opponent. Like she'll say things like she's been bashing Pete Buttigieg for days and it's hilarious. But
Yeah.
like then she'll post just this straight communism, like mental health therapy is a guaranteed right. And it's like, what?
I know.
But it's just like the most complete kind of nonsense. Like, yes, it's not even like housing is a right. Like, we'll build you a hut. It's like everyone is guaranteed a $60,000 a year therapist. Like, what? Where? Is this insanity?
I
Like,
don't, that's what I was just talking to my husband about. I'm like, where did this thing of like everything's a human right come from? I just feel like if you know anything about history, nothing is really a human right. Like if you survive, you're lucky. And so much of it is luck. I don't know where this like literally everything is a human right.
well, yeah, I mean, so I'm a moralist in the sense that I think there's a human empathic sense. So there
Yes.
are things that I
I
wouldn't
agree.
do. Like, so, but there are things I wouldn't do, like kick a puppy to death,
Right.
generally. And I think that there are moral systems that are better than others against an objective standard almost everyone agrees with, like the UN codicil against rape or something like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in that sense, you can say, well, there is morality. There's a human sense of this, and this system works better than this system. But I mean,
Yes.
I don't think that there's an ultimate moral standard that you're going to be judged by on the bridge of the separator or something like that. Like if you're alone in the woods and you're attacked by a pack of wolves and you tell the wolves it's evil to eat you, they're still going to eat you. Like in
Yeah.
the unless you can kill them all. In the objective sense, these things don't exist. We're just smart enough talking monkeys that we've made them kind of real among one another. And it's always important to keep that in mind.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
why don't I have a duty to give you everything you want, even at significant cost to me? Well, because I don't, because your God's not real. And at any time, I could just say, well, to hell with you. You're wasting a lot of my time and go away. So all this
Mhm.
has to be socially negotiated. I mean, like, there's a certain level of comfort we want to give our fellow citizens. But if our
Right.
fellow citizens begin acting like useless enemies, there is that amoral calculus that comes from absolute reality that underlies the made up fairy tales we tell ourselves, where we start acting, why would I give this noisy enemy anything? And the
Right.
wise person doesn't really provoke that or make that happen. So, I mean,
Mhm.
that actually is just a statement of reality. No, of course, at some level, you don't owe everyone in society a private paid therapist. I actually am a
Private
believer
jets
in.
are a human right.
Well, Tom Sowell once said that when you say that some things are right, it means one of three things. Unless his definition of an evil person was someone without an empathic sense. So unless you're an evil person, which is someone without an empathic sense, in which case you're not really in this conversation and we'll use you as some kind of elite soldier or whatever. But if you're in the conversation, a right means either one, this is something that's recognized by most of, let's not complicate it, the great legal and moral systems.
Mhm.
Everyone says, okay, that's a right. Um, well, actually, that's it. That's a combination of one and two. Sorry,
Okay.
but so either that it's recognized by all of the great legal and moral systems. I guess you could subdivide that as it's recognized by your legal and moral system. It's relevant where you are right now. Or three, it's just a thing that you would like to have apply to your situation, and that's what liberals almost always mean by it's a right.
Right.
So if you were to say an expensive therapist is a human right that you owe me. And I were to say, well, is that recognized by American law? Well, no. Is that recognized by the UN codicils that are on point? No, no, of course not. Well, I mean, I happen to be a Catholic. Is it recognized by Christianity? No, no, your stupid wog religion. Okay, what about the great Eastern religion of Hinduism? No, 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 no. What the great native beliefs? No, 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 no. Is anybody anywhere? No. So you just want it? Yes. I mean, that's essentially the root of the argument. And I mean, that's sort of why Marxism is so appealing as a quasi religion. It's just, I want as much of what's in society as I can get, and you should give it to me. And this is the new rule. The
Right.
problem is that for that to be successful, all of the so actually I just realized that this is the problem with Marxism. Like for that to be successful, all of the defenders of the old rules, all of them have to be beaten in war. One,
Mm.
and then the people that led kind of the new rule army have to just decide to give up what they just got and divide it up among their followers. So you've got
Mhm.
two big hills to overcome, I would say. Two of them.
Yeah, very big hills.
Yeah, yeah,
I
not
could
small,
talk to you forever. We should definitely
but
do this
unfortunately.
again.
Yeah.
And I always ask my people the same two questions at the end of every podcast. What is your biggest defect of character?
I mean, obviously blatant amorality. No, but I mean, like banter aside, what is my biggest defect of character? I actually don't think I'm much more amoral than most men of my type, and I don't think that's a defect of character. My biggest defect of character, probably laziness.
You are
Uh,
not. If you are lazy, I am a literal sloth. I mean, you're so prolific. I don't. Is it
but
just
no,
because
like
you know you're
a sort of
capable of
lazy
more?
glibness. I train myself to be prolific by literally dividing the day up into hour-and-a-half segments. So
Okay.
I literally make myself go to the dojo for an hour and a half a day, or like the gun range, because now I'm getting
Mhm.
lazy and fat and I don't like people hitting me. But I mean, the gun range for an hour and a half a day. Then I go to the library for an hour and a half a day. But I mean, left to my own devices, I'm quite lazy. And I do tend to be glib. Like if I search
Mm.
for something, if I'm looking for sources, I'm very likely just to click on the first one and be like, yeah, that looks good enough. It occasionally will bite you in the ass in a scholastic paper. That's surprisingly common, by the way, among academics. Like when I'm reading through other people's bibliographies, because the expectation is that no one will. Like the
Right.
sources are often just ridiculous. Like I got this insight from a black woman's dream, and it's just like what? So I don't think I'm worse than a lot of people, but laziness is my biggest character flaw.
And what's your biggest asset?
Um, I think actually being willing to persevere is my biggest asset. So, I mean, I think when I was a kid, I experienced actual, like, real hardship. I
Mhm.
mean, I was born in a single mother family in what at the time was the murder capital of the USA, Chicago, born on the South Side, later moved to the North. Then I moved to what was at that time the murder capital, the east side of Aurora. So got a balanced high crime childhood there. But I mean, I played competitive varsity sports, although honestly, my best sport was middle distance running. I don't have any like all state stories. But just through all that, I ended up working my way partly through college. I had a lot of friends that were frankly involved in crime at the time, which I guess is another competitive business. So I got to pick up some tricks from them. But I mean, I went to one of the country's elite law schools. I went to the University of Illinois, so more competition. I
Mhm.
dealt with a family illness, kind of pushed through that. You know, I helped run a canvas office actually for a civil rights campaign. This was actually gay rights, which I still support, but I mean,
Mhm.
prior to there being gay rights. So again, kind of a hard, unpleasant experience. Worked on a sort of bullpen sales X trading floor, just like did all those sort of young male things back to back to back. I'm also a professional weapons instructor. I also hunt. So just a lot of those like competitive, actual like things might die experiences, and have not disgraced myself. I've been pretty good at most of them. So that's my actual strength. Like if a burglar came into my house, I'd probably kill him. You know, if
Yeah.
I were talking to a Jesuit priest at an airport, I'd probably be an interesting debating partner. Like I've picked up a
Mm.
lot of actual skills living life.
I love that. I wonder too, one question that just popped in that I'm curious about. What's something that you've changed your mind about?
I think something I've changed my mind about is like the utility of being like young and this is kind of like I read your slut era piece and I thought it
Mhm.
was good. Something similar that I've changed my mind about is like the utility of being like young and pretty and dirty and evil. Like, I mean, my high school tribe was like raver basically,
Yeah.
and it was very similar city kid experience.
Yeah.
Like, I used to be really all about like the new atheists, and like my attitude would be kind of like we coming, you know,
Yeah.
we we people from the cities like I don't hate to talk like a young pompous ass, but like we people from the cities with the mile spire buildings who know how to fuck and kill with our pretty feminist girlfriends and our brilliant books of ideas and like But I mean, like, we're going to change the world. And like,
Yeah.
I think everyone has thought like that. I think the hippies think like that too. And
Yep.
the god
Yep.
awful postmodernists think like that now. And I think I've really changed my mind and recognized that most previous generations have probably also thought of sex and gunfire and the fact that there have been a variety of gods over the years. I mean, so there is something incredibly annoying about that in retrospect. Like, I mean, the I've talked to some of the former new atheists like James Lindsay and so on at a pretty personal level. And I think that what they all, Peter Boghossian's on, I think what they all expected was that absent idiotic religion, and this is certainly the case with the ethical sluts too. I've hung out with some of them. Like, I mean, the idea was that absent the things people believed, rationality would arise. People wouldn't fight or die for stupid, illogical nonsense. But I
Mm-hmm.
mean, in reality, since the rise of kind of what I once called the most sustained attack on monotheistic religion since Alaric the Goth, like since that point, what we actually saw is the rise of the alt-right, like
Right.
Occupy, the Tea Party, social justice. So it seems that people need some kind of flag to march behind. And I
Yeah.
actually think the old
Steven
world,
Crowder.
yeah. But I mean, like all this stuff, like there's like the fact that, but like that urge toward beef seems to be unavoidable. Like I remember, like so I'm still into hip hop, and I subscribe to Double XL magazine. And for about 10 years, Double XL magazine has been beefing with the Source magazine. They stopped for a while, now they started again. And it's literally so like the hip hop magazines don't get along.
Yeah.
Like they're literally there've been brawls between the staffs of like these highly paid hip hop magazines. And by the way, these aren't all street guys. Like the people who started the Source went to Harvard. So it's just
Yeah.
that urge to
To
get
beef.
that, yeah, to have beef plateau with people for some stupid ass reason is
Yeah.
extremely prevalent. And like now you see it, like I wouldn't be surprised to see like Crowder and Matt Walsh get in a fight. Like that urge to have angry confrontations with people across the table from you for no reason is extremely prevalent. So I think that I was very much a part of that idea of my wave is going to come. I actually once wrote an outline for the book Rational Amorality, explaining how my
Mm.
purely logical ethical philosophy could change the world, which probably would have gotten published. And thank God it didn't. But I mean, like, I could see 10 years, I could see like now people being like, oh, you're the guy that wrote the Devil's Bible. Like, what a piece of shit that was, you know, instead
The
of like
Devil's
my
Bible.
quantitative articles and so on. So, I mean, that's something I've changed my mind about, that that each generation can perfectly change the world alone for the first time ever.
Yeah, it's such a that just comes with years, I think too. I was just so I mean, you just think you know everything. Not everyone maybe, but generally I feel like that's a very young 20s. That's just part of being in your 20s is you're like, I know everything. These olds, I'm going to change the world. And then you grow up and you're like, I was an idiot. I've been
Well,
humbled by life.
it's actually a Christian idea, right? Like the 33 degrees of knowledge, like once you
Mhm.
learn, and it's phrased, it's not like sex and killing people, but it's like, the secret of, Eve's apple and Adam's tools and so on. But like once you learn how to do the basic human things, you feel you have all knowledge. But I
Right.
mean, the 360 degrees of knowledge is understanding those skills at a higher level, but also understanding that every previous person to reach the title of master in anything also understood them. So I mean
Right.
that's something that people don't always grasp. I mean, not to just ramble on, this is probably my last comment, but I see this a lot with the different waves of feminism. Like most people that I've dated or been close friends with who were women were feminists of some kind or another, just because they weren't self-hating and they lived in cities. I
Right.
mean, like they weren't hard body annoying with it, but just, I mean, most people are second wave feminists. They have jobs, for example.
Yeah.
But I mean, what it struck me that many feminist women did not understand is that many of the systems they were tearing down were put in place by women. Like the idea that it would normally take a certain number of dates for a man to show that he was financially stable and not a rapist before you would sleep with him probably was not invented by men.
Yeah.
Like, definitely it should be at least 3 expensive dinners before we hook up. Like, the guys were probably not proposing this. And this
Yeah.
goes back even further to the ideas of chivalry and so on. Like women,
Mm-hmm.
Catherine de Medici, what's her name, de Agincourt, very notably drew these up. There were written manuals around these ideas, the ideas of courtly love and so on. So without getting too pompous about this, I mean, the framework that you're destroying, there's a Chesterton's fence element to this. Like, one, you're assuming that it's drawn up by your male opponents, and two, you're assuming that whoever drew it up, it had no purpose. And in
Right.
fact, neither of those things is correct. So now you find these people, these young men and women, in the awkward position of rediscovering civilization again.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
this is just as true for the gentleman. Like, oh, you mean if we have 10 drinks and I'm terrible in bed, I might find that she tells my friends about it or even accuses me of rape. Well, yeah, that might happen. You know, people could have told you about that. There's
Yeah.
a lot of history on this side of the fence as well, buddy.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said for knowing some of the things that have been accumulated in that great snowdrift of time that existed before you came.
Yeah. That's so true. That's such a great wise statement that we will end on. Where can we find you and all of your work and everything that you do? And I still actually do think you could save the world.
Still actually do think, I don't know, I've fallen off.
No, I still think, I still think in light of you maybe thinking that you can't, I still believe, unlike you who thinks you've learned, I still think you can.
Oh, I was teasing. It's good to hear I'm genuinely complimented. In order to find me, I'm very easily accessible. The short, simple answer I generally give is just Google me.
Okay.
You'll find my website through the university, my Twitter, which is at Will, WIL, underscore duh, underscore beast, BEAST 630. Actually, my Facebook should still be in the top 10 or 12 if you really want to talk to me on a personal level. But certainly my articles, I'm an occasional columnist for National Review and so on. And I'm at the level of a very quasi fame where I'll still reach out and argue with you on the internet and that sort of thing. So I look forward to talking to you.
You don't even have to be at that level because Elon will do it too. So we're
Yeah.
all, apparently you can never grow out of this.
Enough.
Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thanks a lot. Enjoy talking.
It's time for the weekly check-in with Bridget and cousin Maggie. Hello. Hello. I've been watching The Last of Us, which is very on brand for me.
Apocalyptic. Oh, the apocalypse? Yes, that is on brand.
It's funny that was released post-pandemic because you would think that people would be tired of thinking about global pandemics.
Mm-hmm.
But this one was like really bad.
Like an actual devastating, like wipes out most of the planet's population pandemic.
Yeah, maybe this is like a show that makes you feel better about the pandemic you just lived through. Like, oh, it was like like I said in the beginning, it's like pandemic light.
Uh-huh.
It's not like planes falling out of the sky. And
I know. I worry about pandemic real.
one of our questions for factory settings from the subscribers was, expectations we have for our daughter. And it's like, I can't even conceive of the world. I'm like, we're all going to be on UBI. AI is going to have everybody's job. I don't know. Cannot conceive of what the world will look like when she's 15.
Yeah, 20.
Think of how different it was 20 years ago.
I know. And it's only speeding up in terms of the rate of change.
Yeah, even just, it is the singularity. It's like we're on the direct ascent up.
Yeah.
We lived through the curve.
I know. We really did.
And now we're on the just skyrocketing technology outpacing humanity's abilities and ethics and
all of it.
Comprehension.
I think that's why so many people kind of avoid thinking about it. I know I do.
Sorry out there.
But it's, yeah, because it's always that juxtaposition of like the sun is shining here, the birds are singing. And then I think about like, the devastating earthquake in Turkey or in Syria. It's just like weird. Globalization is weird, but it I don't know. There's a lot of horrific things going on these days, I feel like.
I mean, I think there's always horrific things going on in humanity. You're just not so hyper aware of all of them happening at once.
It's like the 24-hour news cycle really tuned us into that.
I've been rereading Mediated again and reading a lot of books about media because I've just become so obsessed with this concept and what it's done and the indifference that's required to survive.
Yeah.
Our modern society.
You have to tune out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because our grandparents didn't have all of this
noise
information coming at them.
No, and I think
they didn't grow up with videos of starving children in Africa.
No. And I think like they had the radio. I think that Thomas said it in the last episode of the Mediated series or maybe it was the episode before, it was like the human mind wasn't made to take in all this media. Like it's a new thing for just
our brains.
Yeah. To have to cope with.
It's been really interesting because as I was mentioning right before we started recording, Factory Settings, the podcast I do with Jaren, for anyone who wants more podcasts from me. That's basically like the verbal equivalent of a writing prompt. We'll just pick a topic and then start talking about it. And we never have any idea where it's going to go or what's going to come up or what it's going to lead to.
Right.
And so much of, as we try and remember things and pull them apart, we're evaluating how much of it was mediated.
Right.
How much of what we thought about sex or porn or whatever the topic was, love and relationships, romance, how much of it was modeled to us by our parents, but how much of it was just the
culturally
I watched Pretty Woman.
Yeah.
And I was like, my favorite movie in the entire world, if you were to say what was your favorite movie as a child, I'd say The Little Mermaid, a story about a woman who literally gives up her voice for a man.
I loved that movie.
But think of that messaging.
I know, that's crazy.
She literally gives up her voice for a dude.
It's pretty messed up.
And that was like Frozen too. Everyone was like, oh, this is the like modern feminist. She's a queen. I'm like, she's literally an ice princess who is walled away from the rest of humans because
she has too much power.
She has too much power. Again. Not sure I'm on board with this messaging.
It's not really female empowerment, if you really want to think about it.
Like, look how empowered this princess is. And I'm like, yeah, she lives in an ice tower alone because she can't handle her power. I don't know. So again, this is all...
I didn't like Frozen very much. I love Moana.
I love Moana too.
One of my favorite modern Disney movies, Pixar.
Yeah, we were the mommies in my mommy chat. I was like, the clipping the nails has become an issue, and she really never. She tries to reach her phones because she sees that we're always looking at them, which is like a mirror of how much we look at our phones, and I hate myself for it. But she doesn't really look at screens and doesn't have. We don't really use tablets, and she doesn't have that. But I've been pretty good in her first year about just not exposing her to too much of it, even though it's everywhere in our society and everyone has a phone. And she's always FaceTiming grandparents, so she's already savvier than ever. And talk about mediated. And the mommies were like, put her in front of a video and you'll be able to clip her nails. And I was like, well, I'll try it. And sure enough, just sat there like a little angel watching Moana.
It's funny because I walked in and I was like, I think this is the first time since she's been born that I've walked in and you guys have had the TV on, to your house.
Yeah.
I was like, this is unusual. The television's on.
Well, we did watch a lot of Downton Abbey and the Newborn Bubble. I binge watched that whole show.
Right. But I mean, that's the Newborn Bubble. And I wasn't over here a lot because I was trying to leave you guys alone for the Newborn Bubble.
And she was just like a houseplant phase. Yeah. As my friend calls it. She's like, you'll miss the houseplant phase once they start moving. And I'm like, oh, and now we're here.
Yep.
Yeah. And again, mediated, it's just like, how do you, and Jaren and I just did an episode about porn and how we grew up with like Playboy being the like, ooh, and now I'm like look at what these kids are exposed to, and how do you navigate that with your kids, and how it's so extra compared to what I grew up with. What I grew up with positively adorable compared to.
I know.
Which scares me. Is that going to be the case for her?
I know.
It's just.
Well, and I have a friend, like my best friend from childhood, who is raising 3 kids, and her daughter's now like 14, 15. They've managed to keep her remarkably unexposed to a lot of things, and I would love to talk to her about it and like kind of how they did it. But I'm also like, what are you setting her up for when she like kind of goes into the world a little bit more?
This is like those kids who are homeschooled and then they go to like a public college and lose their minds.
Go crazy.
Yeah,
I know. That's kind of my question is like, how do you deal with that? Even if you manage to kind of like keep them unexposed from a lot of things you don't want them exposed to, which is great. But then at the same time, what happens when they go to college and are like, oh, all the guardrails are down, I'm free, what can I do?
I feel like my sister did a good job of navigating this with her kids too. But again, they're even older by today's standards of what is everywhere.
Right.
And I'm not sure how to, I don't know. We live in such a mediated, there's a part of me that wants to just go live on a commune, and you'll probably laugh when you get to this part in our podcast that we just did, where it's like, let's just go live. I was like, it would be a funny kind of Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt show to write, where it's just a couple who's like, we're going and we're going to make her churn butter. We're living like homesteaders with no technology. And then she leaves and finds out that there's like a whole technological world out there.
It's like that M. Night Shyamalan
That's
movie,
what he
The
said.
Village.
The Village. Yeah. He's like, I think M. Night Shyamalan made this movie. And yeah, there is that. I don't know. Our parents didn't, for them it was TV.
Yeah.
But TV wasn't talking back to you.
And there were 3 channels when we were growing up.
And there weren't predators who were reaching out to you on TV. And I know people even in LA who have kids, and they're remarkably innocent and unexposed, but they don't have smartphones. I mean, that's like rule number 1 is don't let them have a smartphone until the last possible minute.
I know. I know.
Give them a burner phone or whatever if you want to be able to get in touch with them.
Like, I think my friends with their daughter, when she was like 15, they finally allowed her to have an Instagram account. My friend was like, she could have very easily had one like under a false identity, but I know she doesn't because I know her pretty well. She's a pretty honest kid, and like I think you can tell. But she was like, I don't even think that thought occurred to her. So it's just like kind of depends too on your kid's personality, and then.
But that's part of how you're raised,
right?
Are you raising an ethical, honest kid,
right? And they're that family that spends a lot of time together. It's like it just depends.
Yeah,
how much you see your kids and how much.
Well, like you said, you guys had dinner every night together.
Every night, yeah.
So yeah, somebody asked us for our Q&A for factory settings was like our expectations of parenting and Matilda. And I'm like, it's really less about her and more about me. It makes me realize how much effort I have to put into like my relationship with Jaren. And we kind of went off on a long tangent about all of these things, but I see as an adult the difference in my friends and family members who had parents who stayed together and were loving and supportive and had that core versus parents who split up or whatever.
Right.
And there does seem to be a quite dramatic difference in their own feelings of security and self-confidence.
Or even parents who stayed together and had like unhealthy, dysfunctional relationships that were modeled for them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and my parents were always like, our relationship comes first. That's the priority. Everything else follows from that because you kids are fine if we're fine.
Yeah, that's like how I feel about sobriety too.
Yeah.
Before even my relationship comes sobriety, my relationship, because after that, everything kind of flows downstream of that.
Yeah. Which makes sense.
And then I think about how crazy the world is. And the show I was like up, but couldn't sleep because it just triggers all of that catastrophic thinking that already exists in my mind that, Jaren can dip into it and be like, oh, this is a nice fantasy thing that probably won't happen. And I'm like, this is our future.
This could definitely happen.
It's so creepy. Oh, I mean, they do a great job of making the zombie humans or whatever they are just the creepiest freaking things.
I've heard a lot of great things about the show, and I'm like, I don't want to watch it. I don't want to watch Dark right now. I'm not into Dark these days. I don't want to watch any of that stuff. Give me light and fluffy and happy and comedy and all of it.
Yeah.
I've been binging 30 Rock again lately.
Yeah.
I'm just like,
when I go to that place, I have to go back to 30 Rock or Arrested Development.
I watched Arrested Development on repeat throughout the pandemic.
Yeah.
The first 3 seasons, just over and over and over.
Yeah, you can't go past the first 3. I've never seen them. I won't ruin the sanctity of how brilliant those first 3 seasons were with the later ones.
But what were you going to say? I want you to finish your thought of you were up watching the show, just being like,
I just always think, because I think about the books that really affected me the most in terms of my own fictional works that disturbed me to my core, Blindness being one.
You were traumatized by that novel.
I didn't read fiction for years. That's when I really got into nonfiction, because I'm like, nothing could be more disturbing than that book. And it turns out there is plenty in the human condition that is as disturbing as that book, but it's a very good representation of what happens in those situations.
Right.
And The Road, which was also just so dark and disturbing.
I have not read either of those books. God. I don't know that I need to at all.
And
The Stand is about as dark as I can go in terms of apocalypse. It's not even that dark.
And so it's definitely, I think it does a good job, the show, of alluding to and even our friend who survived the Holocaust said in his podcast that we did on Walk-Ins Welcome, the good ones died. You have to do bad things to generally survive that kind of, when society breaks down and everybody is in starvation survival mode.
Right.
And they do a good job of alluding to that. So far, I'm not caught up to where everybody else is, but they do a good job of alluding to the things they've had to do in order to survive.
Yeah.
And we don't, that's why when people are like, I burn it all down, anarchy, I joke lately, I'm an accelerationist. People can't comprehend what that is privilege.
The breakdown of society.
The privilege to be I want society to break down. I'm like, no, you wouldn't really even last 2 minutes, bro.
Yeah. And I've read it's interesting. I read a series of books, or at least part of a series of books that was about I can't remember who the author was or what they were called. And it was basically something happened globally and all the electricity went off. And then it was what followed? It never came back on. And it was just the starvation and the little communities that spring up. And then it's about some are run by dictators, and then, scrambling for resources and how you form these new societies and all this stuff. And it's just you got to expect a lot of dictators to start to spring up, and thuggery and ruling by just horrific means.
Tribalism. Yeah. It just devolves into tribalism. And it's funny, too, because just yesterday, our white-collar hippie friend reached out to me, and he's always kind of on this, optimistic but planning for Armageddon.
Yeah.
Weird paradox that he lives. And he was like, we're buying a ranch in Texas. You want to go in on it? And Jared and I were like, we do, but we'd also, hate that. He's like, I don't want someone knocking on my door, it's time for us to go, take down the tree.
Right.
Fuck off.
I need to be able to have my own autonomy in that situation. Yeah. You need to be careful who you choose to set up your little community with.
Your compound.
Yeah. And just in case the grid nothing happens.
That's what I mean. I was like, I don't think those scenarios, they usually, I'm sure they work. And because you're not hearing about the ones that work, but it seems like they all end up in like cults and partner swapping and like weird, weird stuff goes on. I don't know that it ends up. I think outside of like being forced into that situation, it's very hard.
Purely survival mode,
unless you're like Amish or it's your whole lifestyle.
Yeah.
I just think of like, the guys in this, it's always like dudes who are in the army that survive this kind of stuff because they have what it takes. The skills, but also the ability to just kill someone.
Yeah, because that's a skill. Like they've learned it, They've been exposed to that situation where it's them or someone else.
And they have trucks.
They've survived it.
What I've learned from all of the media I've consumed is that you need army training and trucks.
And like, I know I'm like, I should really learn how to garden, Like my grandfather had these amazing gardens growing up.
You should start with is stockpiling seeds.
Oh yeah, that's a thing too. I know. It's so many things.
If you really want to go down that rabbit hole.
But I'm like, where am I going to garden right now? I have nothing I have no land.
In your balcony. Start with herbs. We must start somewhere.
Yeah, you guys grow the food. I'll bring the seasoning.
You're like, I've got some rosemary.
My rosemary and thyme are thriving, guys. I'm part of this community, right?
That would be such a funny comedy. Like in the apocalypse is like useless. Everyone is somehow they make it. I've got the rosemary.
Bring all the like flourishes.
Like I've got the thyme.
My basil is amazing. How about some caprese salads?
And I'm over there making the cheese.
Yeah.
Tune in next week for another riveting episode that will change your life, help you get out of your own way, and solve all the world's problems. I want to thank our composer, Jared Elias, my co-producer and cousin, Maggie, and all of you out there listening. This has been Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Phetasy. I'm Bridget Phetasy, and you're welcome. It's the dumbest line.